Come to the front if you like. Welcome, everybody. Warm welcome to today's psychology faculty lecture given by Oliver John.
John Oliver.
Aha. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Oliver John, as today's speaker. And many of you, of course, don't need an introduction, but some of you might not know everything there is to know about Oliver yet. So the first important thing, as we already heard, is that this is Oliver John, not John Oliver. The two sometimes get confused. This last week, someone asked on Twitter, psychologists, how do you all keep track of Oliver John versus John Oliver? Is there a mnemonic system? And Twitter gave some really helpful answers. My favorite was, just remember their subject expertise. Politics all over, that is John Oliver. The Big Five Don, that is Oliver John.
Oh, that's right.
And yes, it does. And we'll be hearing today about the research from Oliver that makes him the Big Five Don. But first, I want to give a little bit of background on his career and his research. Oliver started out his life and his academic career.
Oh, no.
In Germany, in the town of Bielefeld. And after getting his master's degree there, he went far, far away to the University of Oregon, where he earned his PhD in psychology. And lucky for us, he decided to stay on the West Coast and came to UC Berkeley to the social personality psychology area in 1987, and he's been here ever since. I gotta be honest. And Oliver has made some major contributions to psychology, actually to multiple fields within psychology. The first major contribution, and that's his Big Five research, is to personality psychology, and we'll hear more about that today. But he's actually made a second really major contribution, really transforming the field of emotion regulation, which is my own field of research. And most importantly, focusing on understanding individual differences in how people regulate their emotions, the antecedents of those individual differences, and consequences they have for health, for well-being, and for social functioning. In addition to those big contributions, Oliver's work also addresses really fundamental additional questions, like how do people develop during adulthood and adolescence, accuracy and biases in how people perceive themselves, and also how we can do research on the internet. And I believe that was way before other areas. He's been primary mentor alone for 22 students in the area, and many of whom have gone on to make really important contributions of their own. More personally, Oliver has played a really big role in, I think, making our department the way it is, and especially our area, as a colleague, a friend, and a mentor to us more relatively younger people. And really, in addition to being a brilliant psychologist, Oliver is the most lovely and cheerful colleague one could wish for. He's incredibly generous with his time, with his intellect, with his good nature, and of course, always with the most recent harvest from his garden, apples, figs, potatoes, and then also, of course, with wine that he often bestows on us. So with that, I just want to say thank you for this talk today. Thank you for being you. And let's dive into the big five.
All right. Thank you, Iris. Let me just try this again here. All right. That was a little overwhelming. Thank you, Iris. So I have a complicated job today. I'm supposed to teach you about something that has 5 dimensions and at least 15 facets, and at the end there's going to be a test. Okay, so whether you have assimilated this all, but I need to start out with a confession that says I'm a very terrible prognosticator. I'm often wrong. And I have a 16-year-old who agrees heartily with that. She reminds me every day at least 7 times that I'm wrong about everything that she can think of. My grad students also like to point it out. And you might wonder, what are the many things I've been wrong about? The Berlin Wall coming down. I would have bet multiple $1,000s I would not in my lifetime see the wall come out. Very much wanted it to happen, but it did, but not because same-sex marriage, very much wanted to happen, just didn't think I would still see it. And the third one you may wonder is solving the conundrum of personality structure. You may not quite think it's the same importance, but to me, it was a big issue. And so I get to talk to you today about how some of that came about.
Were you wrong that we were going to solve it, or you're wrong that we weren't going to?
I thought it was not going to be solved until like 30 years after me, shipping off to the divide. So my job here is somebody told me that if you talk about the big five, you should only have 5 chapters for this talk. So I will probably not get to number 6. But I'm going to try. So I'm going to talk about some history and the problem with Richard. And Richard is not Rich Ivory, who is a good friend all the way back to grad school. This is Richard from a different. And then I'm going to talk about basics, which is going to define and elaborate that ocean for you. And ask the question, why are they big? Why, Then I'm going to talk about some really big questions like, is marriage possible? Can he change? I'm often asked, will he change? Can he change after age 40? 30. Should you have kids? Fundamental issues. Then we'll talk about some recent research in weird countries. Social and personality psychologists are obsessed with that we should no longer do work in weird countries like this one, ours, truly weird. There's going to be a photo break so you can catch your breath. Whoops, sorry, that was the wrong button there. Then I'm going to come back home and talk about the pandemic here at UC Berkeley. If I have time, I want to say the Big Five is an open system where we can add traits. It's not finished, right? So we can still find other specimens that we didn't know about. And then number 7 is when old people give advice. So I chose this field that says your job is to describe individuality. And I didn't quite realize what a crap field this is. And I'm giving you an example. This is Richard, who is 34 years old. He has problems sitting at his desk for more than a few minutes, cannot get organized, loses keys and wallet. See, this is not Rich at all. And forgets about his plans for the evening, fails to achieve up to his potential work. His mind wanders, he interrupts others, blurting out what he is thinking without considering the consequences. Gets into arguments, mood swings, periodic outbursts. Now his marriage is in trouble. Okay? That's the raw data. That's the kind of stuff that supposedly we get handed, and then we're supposed to make sense of that and organize that in some way. And I remember, and Rich remembers this, there was this point where cognitive psychology was looking for the conceptual primitives, right? It's a hard job, and it's not surprising that personality psychologists thought about this to the point where all the outsiders are saying, why the heck are you doing this? Why do you care so much? But the problem is, if you own the language, if you own the conceptual primitives, you rule the roost, right? And so they all thought they were going to be Jesus, right? So Cattell thought he came down from Mount Olymp or wherever they were, with a 16 PF, 16 factors. Eysenck had Penn. Jack Block, who was, so the three people that were here when I arrived, had 2. So 16, 3, 2. Harrison Goff, who was in a different part of the building, did not talk to Jack Block, had 20 on the CPI. And then Ravenna Helson, who seemed the most reasonable of this cast of characters to me, was still using the MBTI, which is like, very worrisome to hear. And that has 4. Okay. So the spirit of the field was competition, not collaboration. Sort of, it's really kind of the dark ages. And my favorite quote is that really Eysenck was so pissed off when the big 5 raised as sort of a little something and wanted to, claim a bit. He says, if you guys are big, then mine are the giant 3. Okay, so it's truly a pissing contest. Mine is bigger than yours. Mature male behavior, in their 60s. Okay. All right. So this Tower of Babel that was happening couldn't really continue. We even have a concept called the jingle jangle fallacy, right? It's a technical term and means that sometimes you have measures that have the same name, but they measure different things. And then the jangle is that you have things that have different names, but really measure the same one. So that's really, too much to deal with. And people realized in the 1980s and 90s that we needed to go do some foundational work because no common framework, no accumulation of findings, no progress. Am I doing this? Sorry. If it bothers anybody, we can try. Okay. So basically, what people realized is we needed a consensual taxonomy. And taxonomy is hard and often contentious and controversial. So I'd love to see that the astronomers reassign Pluto, that had comfortably been a planet, to no longer be a planet. So I'm glad that we are not the only ones struggling with these issues. But what you need is empirical approach. That sort of Jesus thing, I'm going to bring it to you, was not going to happen. And you need collaboration. And it was really very much sort of a crowd size, having lots of different groups work on this. So one of the great things about the Big 5 is nobody owns them. They've not been copyrighted. They cannot, everybody can play and be part of it. And then the big surprise for me, and I'll spare you all these details, but we really thought, right, this was a time where we thought everything was culturally specific. Universals were dead. Anybody who said anything about universals, was going to be booed. And so we thought everything was going to be specific. And then we found this surprising convergence across labs, languages, and cultures, and this consensus emerged that I didn't really think was possible. Now you think the big five are old because you had to deal with me. I arrived at Berkeley sort of around here. There were like, maybe 20 papers written on the big five. I read them all and reviewed them in 1990. And, the dark ones is the big five. And then there's Cattell and Isaac, who were sort of the, people holding the kind of ruling the roost. And you can see they hung on. Science moves slowly. You can see finally, in the early 2000s, we're kind of creeping up there. And then it kind of, by here, we're looking at like 4,000. We're not looking. So let me get my adapter. So we're looking at about 4,000 publications versus, 800 for Cattell and Isaac combined. So you end up with a factor of 8, right? Of about 8 to 1. Yeah. Use that one. Yep. It goes right there. Perfect. So it's kind of hard to remember that it's new because you've been spared having to read, and actually have to screw it in. It's fine. Okay, good.
And let me just screen share yours. Okay.
All right.
No.
All right, perfect.
No,
Well, this
it's not coming up.
You can use the blackboard.
usually works.
Sure.
Hmm.
No, not today.
Hold on, let me just see. Nope,
Okay.
there it is. There it is. Okay. All right, just a little slow. Okay, so basically, what?
It's not sharing for Zoom. Sorry, it's a lot of money. Here.
So we're having like 3 different things going on at the same time. So my next. All right, next section is to define and elaborate. No, well, come on. Thing. Okay, there we go. Okay. So let me just get rid of this. All right, so the ocean fight, that sounds like a movie. It should be a movie. So I'm going to start with the one that starts with O, which is good, but it's also the Berkeley factor. Okay, it turns out that virtually everybody in this room scores high on O. Okay, sort of unavoidable because you guys like to explore things. You try different foods. You like to travel. I mean, I can give you a whole litany of things that are likely to be true about you guys. And I wanted to acknowledge that even though the big fivers are claiming openness, it actually goes all the way back. Some of the more educated among us know that Carl Rogers came up with that concept. So it's not really coming from out of nowhere. We can also think about these personality dimensions as reflecting emotional processes. And the core one for O is interest. Being interested in things, I have a paper with Dacher and several grad students. All is another piece that connects up with this exploration system. If you, let me see whether this works. Oh, this works. So if you're curious about somebody who scores high on O, it's that guy, right? I mean, very few famous people have a picture taken of themselves like this. When people rate themselves on traits like curious, original, complex, and imaginative, it predicts better performance on objective creativity tests. Not only do these people say they have these characters, it predicts test scores designed by our creativity researcher friends. It predicts interests, namely interest in investigative and artistic careers and being more successful. So the people who are higher on O make more money in those kinds of jobs. And if you think about values, again, look at yourself. You value freedom over, traditions and, stifling security. You want an interesting life. That's our researchers in value talk about stimulation, right? We want a stimulating life. A lot of my colleagues say this is all about information seeking. I kind of like the exploration system, which goes back to Bowlby as the better summary. Now, what is it negatively related to? How about conventional attitudes, or in this case, conventional hair, right? And there's actually somebody who many of you guys will remember, I do, who was described by his own staffers as remarkably incurious. The reason why that is so remarkable is very rarely do we use a negation like incurious. You guess who this is? It's the cowboy riding there on his farm, okay? He was famous for not reading. It turns out openness is also connected with storytelling and being interested in all of that. Okay, it connects with music preferences. Can you guess what does he not like? Jazz, right? Jazz is not something that George W. Would be into. Now, I do, even though Jack Block was one of the most difficult people to be in one department with, he was still a smart guy, right? Obnoxious, but he did have a few good ideas. And so I've been inspired by some of these items that he's used, and we've adapted some of them. One of the things in my field is we steal each other's items, okay? It's like, it's a terrible thing, but I think Jack will be happy to see that his stuff lives on. Is curious and exploring. There's your exploration system, right? He named it. Likes to learn new things. True of most people in this room. Has a vivid imagination, is creative in the way they think, play, or work. Daydreams. That's why openness is not the same thing as IQ. Okay? IQ has nothing to do with daydreaming. In fact, it's going to be really bad for you to daydream when you're taking an IQ test. And it's very much sort of one of the things, the funny things that happened to me about 8 years ago. I was in my old age discovered, as I'm too old to be discovered, but it turns out the economists would like to predict stuff about people, like in schools and so on. And they said, well, these weird personality people, they can predict stuff about things that happen in people's life. And they love openness because that's a 21st century characteristic. Okay, flexible adaptation to changing environments, innovation through learning, change your mental models. It's critical for change and personal growth. That's all what O kind of connects with, and I love it. It's my favorite one of the big five. The second one is not my favorite because it goes with things like time management and deadlines and regulating yourself in tasks so you meet standards, right? Standards, expectations. It all seems really silly. Why do we need that kind of stuff? But the chairs of the psych department have told me multiple times that those things are important, and I'm working on it. Now, again, if you think this is, again, one of the kind of weird things that we've come up with is we've come up with a terrible label. What the heck is conscientiousness, right? All my Brazilian friends can't even say, they say consciousness. No, conscientiousness, okay? And Max Weber, anybody remember Max Weber? The Protestant work ethic. That's what this is in a fundamental way. And now if you can put O and C together, we get something that's called the learning circumplex. So I'm going to show that to you in a second. So here, last hooray to Jack, has high standards for himself, right? We want grad students who set high standards for themselves. Planning things out, sounds good to me. Doesn't give up easily, persistent. That's been reinvented as grit, by the way, in case you want to buy a popular book. There's an entire book about conscientiousness called Grit. Angela Duckworth's a good friend of mine, but she worked for McKinsey. And then you, of course, have to relabel things and publish them as books, but that's fine with me. Makes things happen, gets things done. Well, we want that in people, right? It's a really critical thing. So I'm going to skip over, and Oz will say, self-regulation is a broad word. So it's really managing self in tasks. It's more narrow, okay? We'll come to some other self-regulation things in a second. So what do you predict about a student who has these kinds of characteristics? How are they going to do in school? Well, this was a big revelation. Turns out personality predicts how people do at school. duh, conscientiousness predicts better reading, writing, spelling, and math, about the same effect sizes. We actually have a more recent study in Denmark where we have everybody. They said the entire school system is going to participate. So shockingly, we have all the people at the low scores that would never be in our volunteer and other wacky samples. There, the effect sizes are about 0.35. So they're certainly real, important, and consequential. And there is my second one, openness. So how come I became a professor despite my sort of dubious conscientiousness? Well, I'm incredibly curious, right? And that is another path to doing well in the school context. All right, that was the learning circumflex. Two things that combine, so you can think of students who are dreamers, right? They have all these great ideas, super high openness, but they never finished anything. Well, that's the problem with C, right? You have the people who just want to finish and not sort of engage deeply. I find them the hardest to deal with because they are very proud that they're finished, but it's not publishable the way it's finished, right? Okay, E, I hate the label extroversion. I mean, I adore Jung's, extensive and rambling writings. I have a big argument with my wife about Jung. I call him a muddlehead, and she finds this incredibly insulting that I don't see the complexity in all of these things. But he came up with a core dimension, and we now think of this as being about the approach system. That is, in other words, we see rewards or gains or things we want, and do we energize and go after it? So that's E. And then A, this is the other thing. So I have friends who do research with brains, and they have a concept called affiliation. And it drives me bonkers because that concept doesn't exist. It is two things. So think about Trump, right? Is Trump high on affiliation? Well, according to E, he likes to hang out with people and he basks in their adoration. But is he a kind of a caregiving, loving, long-term bondy kind of person? Not really, right? So it's sort of the difference between Trump and Rudy that I want to emphasize here, right? As that with Rudy, you get that big A, and we renamed it. We call it amity because the original label is agreeableness, and that sounds like you're sort of a pushover, not like a love-a-bear, a hug-a-bear, kind of person. So that's all about long-term bonds. And I think Docker couldn't make it, but Docker is trying to bring Tim Leary back from the dead with all the psychedelics work. So he was a good scientist. He had that A dimension, and there's a guy named Bakan, he called it communion. Here's the interpersonal circumflex. And it's only a half circle because, the reverse keyed items would be on this side here, but you can see this is assertiveness, right? That is part of extroversion, but it's not very agreeable, right? Usually people who assert themselves, you kind of have to push back, right? Then there's gregariousness and excitement seeking, and you go up towards, so like what is warmth on the neo actually is kind of a blend of E and A. And you go up north, you see compassion, respectfulness. So Docker calls this the pro-social space. And then you go to the left where people are sort of giving up potentially too much, right? Modesty, where they are not claiming your rightful place in the world. So I want to talk about briefly another big difference between A and E. This is a project with Ori Ellis and Anne Kring that is not yet quite published, so we are going to come back to it. And this basically says you can anticipate joy from different kinds of relationships. And Anne taught me about the importance of anticipation, so that's why I hate surprise parties, because you're cheating me of like 2 weeks of anticipating this great thing that's going to happen, right? So part of pleasure is anticipating it. And so Anne had this idea that we should look at the anticipation of social pleasure. And so we had items about friends, about family, and new people. And this will come back when we talk about the pandemic. So planning to see a friend I'm close to brings me joy. What should that be related to? Is that primarily an extroversion piece or a kind of agreeableness, amity piece? Amity, right? So you're already close to that person, right? There's family. I get excited when I think about spending time with my family. So there is excitement, right? But it's about people that you've already have a connection with. And then I look forward to parties and social gatherings where I will meet new people, right? That seems different. And see, it's a separate factor. And this is what it looks like in terms of, these are regression coefficients. You can see the big difference between A and E is right here. New people. Give me some new people. I'm dying to meet somebody, people were saying during the pandemic. Whereas A says, I'm going to take care of my family and my friends. Right? So you can see this in the different kinds of role relationships that we have. And we are very concerned about replication. So I can do this dance here. You know, so it replicates. All right, so Ocean, where are we? Okay, we've done the interpersonal 2. Now we have N. Turns out the MBTI doesn't have N. The MBTI also only has nice things because they want to sell it to as many people as possible. We're going to say, you have negative feelings. Maybe you should change. That's not good. You are perfect the way you are. Let's not talk about N. That's why there's only 4 on the MBTI. But you don't want to be 0 on negative emotionality because fear is there for a reason, right? I mean, my friends in neuroscience will tell us, right, that, well, it's actually, there's some terrible research by Ising. It turns out the soldiers that scored the lowest on this thing were the ones who were dead first in the war. So being vigilant is actually a very useful thing to punishments and losses. And so what I want to say explicitly, the old people, right, the previous theorists weren't stupid, right? They just only had one piece of the elephant, right? One of them had the, the trunk, and one had the tail, and, various parts. So putting it together really required a, a whole field, joint effort. One of the reasons why the economists love this is that this stuff is independent of cognitive skills, right? So they've had heard of IQ, being good at solving problems, that they've heard of. They just didn't know that they were so-called, they called the stuff that I do non-cognitive skills, which I find really insulting because openness and conscientiousness are clearly cognitive, right? How could, all of them have a cognitive piece. Now I could spend about 20 hours talking about measurement, and we'll happily answer questions later, but I want to show you this really cool project that we're doing with the World Bank in this place that nobody can pronounce, Kyrgyzstan or something like that. And so here's your first test. What does this measure? It's only 5. Come on, this is a multiple choice test. Oh, of course, look at that. This kid just seen the stupid slide. This kid, oh my God, right? Talk about imagination. And so the kids rate themselves on a rating scale that goes with this thing. How about this one? Conscientiousness, right? Looking out the window and, not really making much. Look at, I love this graphic artist. It was hard work because not all artists are psychologists, but, I got him to had all this stuff is strewn all over the table, kid is looking out the window, etc. And here's one more. Extroversion, right? E, engaging with others. You want to play alone? Right? Let's just erase the other kids. That's actually what the guy did, you sort of, he threw that one and then you erase the other, bring the other ones in. Okay, so where are we? Well, this took longer than it was supposed to. So we've done history and basics. No, we're doing basics now? No. No, okay, we've defined and elaborate Ocean. That's great. Okay. So how do we score? I already told you openness. We cannot possibly not score high on openness. Now, most the undergrads, at least, they want to help people, right? Everybody wants to go into clinical psychology because they're sympathetic and caring and all of that good stuff. And wow, do we have a bunch of neurotics among ourselves, right? We kind of have all this access, easy access to negative emotions, rumination, etc. So like an occupational hazard. I'm going to just say briefly, in France, they do a terrible experiment on human beings. They admit they let 1,000 people start medical school, but they only have 150 seats. What happens to the other 850? Well, they are axed on the basis of exams like in things like inorganic chemistry. Now, would I have been in the 150? No, I was on a poetry group and a film team. I'm just gonna do one thing, right? So guess what? The 15% score lower in A and lower on O. Why lower there? Because it's competition. I'm gonna hide the textbook so the other people can't see it, right? So in France, the doctors are low in O and low in A. That's a really great combination, right? Not really curious. And don't give a shit about the patients. I pointed that out to them at a medical congress, and they said, but we want the smartest ones. I said, those are not correlated with smarts, right? You can have it both ways. But I think in the US, it's already changed really substantially. So you are dying to know what happened with Richard, right? So can we apply our new taxonomy to Richard? Problem sitting at desk, not organized, loses keys, forgets, fails to achieve. What is that? Low C, right? Low C. What about the red? Interrupts others, arguments, outbursts, marriage in trouble. Think about relationships, right? Marriage is in trouble, arguments. So it's low A, right? And we often confuse high N with low A. But this is kind of getting into trouble with others, right? Not being rude, not a kind of controlling, aggressive, and selfish impulses. Now, anybody here who studies with Steve Hinshaw? Okay, what is, oh, there you are. Hello, hi. What is it? ADHD, right? That is actually, no. No, I was not going to say that. Steve studies these folks, right? And so this is a classic ADHD presentation. So from our perspective, ADHD has at least 2 personality components, and in fact has 3. So this was a study that we did with Joel Nigg and Steve and I and a couple of other colleagues. I've never had a big effect size like this. So these are people diagnosed with ADHD, young adults. They score 2 standard deviations lower than a normal sample of that same age. So they're at the 3rd percentile on conscientiousness, right? So even though it sounds like there's hyperactivity, it has nothing to do with activity as in the sense of in extroversion, right? It is all about focusing attention, managing time. So it turns out Laura Bell, who is a student of Steve's that I'm also working with, is we're trying to tease this apart. So agreeableness, that second piece, it's a small effect, but that's related to hyperactivity, impulsivity. And then neuroticism sounds actually like a secondary piece because, people with ADHD get all this negative feedback because they screw up and they don't do things right and so on. So we think, well, we'll see whether we can really find decent evidence for it, but that may not be a defining piece of ADHD, but a consequence. Yes.
Is it okay to ask questions?
Yes, ask a question. Sure.
How do you differentiate self-regulatory capacity from agreeableness in the Richard example, right? Because yes, it's directed at others, but you're interrupting, your marriage is in trouble. That it is agreeableness, of course, because the target is other people, but there's a self-regulation component there. So I would have said still C or something like that.
So C is specifically about tasks, right? About managing yourself to do tasks. So one idea here is that, and I don't think Steve is very excited about this, but it's that if you fail at those tasks of living with your partner or with other kids, they're unhappy about that and you get into trouble. And etc. Now, the other piece, the other idea is that there's a broader, as you were saying, a broader self-regulatory set of issues that also show up in terms of the outbursts and that kind of thing. So those, I mean, they're clearly, you know, two potential things going on, but psychologically, from my perspective, agreeableness is when somebody else is involved, whereas C is about how you manage tasks, right? And so there is like regulating, aggressive and selfish impulses is distinct from having trouble focusing on the task, your attention on the task, and finishing the task. Those are psychologically separate, even though they could draw on the same regulatory processes, right? The processes may be general. Okay,
Oliver, I'm
so,
gonna shout out. This is Steve.
Adjustment and well-being. I mean, this is really short. I mean, withdrawal, right? Kids that withdraw is a really huge problem. Aggression problem is low A. Attention problems we had seen as C. Anxiety, depression, somatic complaints is all. And I put Karen Horney in there because she is one of the many brilliant women who, had some of these ideas literally 70 years ago, right? So moving away is withdrawal, moving against, and some people in the field actually using some of these concept again. So one other thing I need to address is I don't want you to go home and talk to your loved one and say, this guy said there's only 5 personality traits. Aren't we more complex than that, right? While we are, and why the heck are they big, right? Maybe Eysenck was right to say mine are giant, but it's an issue of hierarchy, right? In other words, we can talk about creatures, at different levels of abstraction. So if you think about mammal and dog, and that is a dog that I live with, Kazi. So he looks like a German Shepherd, right? So I actually know that's a German Shepherd. Other people, say that's just a dog, who cares? Now you can also say mammal. Now, no biologist would say the fact that you can say this is a German Shepherd negates the utility of mammal, okay? It's only psychologists who would say, your construct is too big, too broad, and therefore stupid, okay? So the idea that you have a hierarchy seems to me rather fundamental, and we call these lower level things facets. So there you have the big 5, and look, they have little children or facets or whatever you want to call them. So if you think about amity, the sort of pro-social thing, compassion, respect, and trust, right? Yes. Yes. Absolutely, you got it. And that's actually a lovely side story. We have these experimentalist social psychology friends, and they say to me, we have these people that don't respond the way they're supposed to. And I said, well, it's called individual differences, right? And there's about 20% of people who are resistant to persuasion in these attitude change experiments. And so they looked at these people, they came up with items, they came up, I like to think for myself. Well, guess what? They rediscovered the intellectual part of openness. So if you look at the openness, it should say intellectual curiosity. We don't like to get our opinions manufactured and handed to us, right? We kind of like to think about them for ourselves. All right. Whew. So we are already on 3. We are making progress. Is marriage possible? Yeah, minor questions. So the concept of marriage suggests that your personality is stable, okay? I know you find this hard to believe, but there is the metamorphosis, Kafka, right? You wake up and the guy that you married has been turned into an ugly beetle. Now imagine you wake up next to a person and their personality has changed completely overnight. That would be very distressing. So we make this assumption that when we tie the knot with somebody, you marry, you find the love of your life at age 20 and say, this is it, we got to stay together. I have bad news, and that is that person may change. Personality traits may not have a stability of 0.90. So we now have data on this stuff, and of course, I was going to sing you. Oh, this is. There we go. Sorry, I was going to sing you When I'm 64, right? That's a Beatles song about will she still, need me, care for me, love me, etc. And so one of the great things about being at Berkeley is that Berkeley's been this home of longitudinal studies. And one of my beloved colleagues, Ravenna Helson, started the so-called Mills longitudinal study. You could never get it funded today because it only had 125 people, i.e. all women. But we have data from age 20 to 30 to 40 to 60 to 70. Okay, you say, well, maybe we don't know for sure that this will all happen the same way, but I think that's a lot better than not having these data. And if you look, and this actually has been shown in other studies as well, so we can compute you can call it a retest correlation, right? It's really stability over time, over 20 years. So you look from 20 to 40, the correlation is about 50. I mean, these numbers look all a little different, but they're all about 0.50. Not significantly different. Now, if you pick, so I wanted to marry somebody who was truly high in openness and hopefully would stay high in openness. I actually gave her the BFI just in case I was wrong, but under full disclosure. And so the chance of getting that openness wrong with a correlation of 0.50 at 20 is 1 in 4. That's pretty bad risk, right? And now if you really want to pick somebody on all 5 of the big 5, you're going to be wrong on at least one of them for sure, right? If you start at 20. So I recommend waiting, not necessarily till 40. I was in my early 30s, let's say. And so the correlation here is 0.70. That's only 1 in 6, right? So your risk is much better. Yes. Well, first of all, it can't just be how it's self-report, because there are studies of peer reports and twin studies and so on. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, we do believe that personality crystallizes as you have more experience, and you realize that pretending to be somebody that you are not is not really worth it. I mean, you may as well just let it out. And if they don't like you, fine, but so there is clear evidence that the kind of where you are in the individual differences rank ordering, right? If you have 100 people that you could marry, who you want to pick, you're going to have a more reliable pick if you can wait a little bit, right? So that's my marital advice for the day. Then the other question is, can he change? Will he change? And so there's a huge debate in the field that by 30, man, it's fixed. Nothing is going to happen after age 30. There used to be this thing that you don't trust anybody over 30. And so the idea, and I'm going to save you guys a long-winded thing, there's lots of theorizing and arguments, but the idea is that as we get out of school, out of the house, and are no longer in this protective world of college, there are pressures on us, right? We have to show up on time, otherwise we get fired. There's consequences to some of our behaviors. There's people that have expectations. My favorite example is Nicolas Cage, who was famous for beating up the occasional photographer, and he said when he was 45, he said, I haven't punched a wall in years. Well, I've never punched a wall ever, but men can have some sort of anger issues. And the good news is that, yes, he is likely to change. Here is agreeableness. This is 21 to 30. So this line is here because some people have drawn a line in the sand and said, we dare you. And we say, we take the dare. Is there change after 30? And you can see people become more agreeable, even men. And it turns out that the other Bob, right? You were there, Bob, too, right? Bob 1 claimed that he'd become more agreeable through the, ministrations of the Cowans and other loving people in the clinical psychology program. So environmental effects can help. Conscientiousness shows this really lovely curvilinear effect that, yes, there's more change before 30, but especially the guys still have a ways to go. And I apologize for all the men, that we don't never quite catch up to the conscientiousness of the women. This is a huge sample. So each of these are 1,000 people because we were early on the internet. And so we have about 1 million, now probably 1.5 million people that completed the BFI. So this is a great evidence, but who the heck is on the internet at, who is 55, right? So I was really worried that we might have self-selection issues. So these are the same data. Remember Mills study. So you see those increases, the curvilinear increase for conscientiousness. So there seems to be something in the longitudinal data as well. Yeah.
What would you say about change from early childhood to
I was going to have the slide in here, and I'm going to come to adolescence in a second, but in your data, we get exactly what we're seeing here. The kids, right? I mean, I remember my kid no longer was biting other children after age 4. So you get an increase in regulating these selfish and aggressive impulses. So you get an increase in A from 4 to 7.5. You get an increase in C. They learn to be students and focus on a task, and you get decreases in N. So this pattern of what we call, socio-emotional maturity that you see here in the adults, you also see in the kids during childhood. And then this is now the next one here. After that, all bets are off. You want to ask me whether you should have children? Close your eyes. Do not watch this next section. Because children, although they are very cute, they eventually turn into adolescents. And a colleague of mine called this how you go from pink pony to the challenges. Now, all the stuff that's on the slide, you've heard this from some of our developmental colleagues. All these changes, there's a book by a guy named Goethe from 1774 called The Sufferings. That's my translation. It's really the sorrows, not the sufferings. That makes much more sense of young Werther. He wrote the first book on unrequited love and teenage suicide. He became an immediate hero. Suicide rate in Germany went up after this was published. They thought about banning the book, just like they're doing here nowadays. The other piece to this is juvenile delinquency peaks. I have time to, so juvenile delinquency in big 5 terms is you're either lacking some of that interpersonal piece, right? Like the guy who stole, a woman that stole my bicycle the other day, didn't really think about how would that make me feel, right? And then low C, they didn't really seem to understand about rules. You work and buy your own bicycle, right? And affective disorders emerge during this time. So the typical line that we hear is that there's a mismatch of all these new impulses and sexual and all this stuff. Drugs are suddenly available. My wine bottles at home suddenly need to be guarded, from children running around who are no longer children. So there's this mismatch of all of this stuff with self-regulatory capacities. And so what does this look like in terms of the big 5? Then this goes back a little bit to Rudy's question. So there's, in terms of low C, difficulties managing time, organizational skills, rule breaking. It's kind of a disaster. If you look at my teenage daughter's room, there's 4 towels that should be in my bathroom. They're in various stages of decomposition on the floor. And there's then A is regulating self-aggressive impulse, said this, and then N is regulating stress, anxiety, sadness, frustration. So my 16-year-old still will occasionally burst out in tears because people are starving in various places of the world, etc. And it is very sad. We just don't necessarily burst out into tears about this at 25. So the hypothesis was there would be a dip in the can, right? So you can see there's an ocean in the can. The can in the ocean is actually the way it is. And then it's less clear for E. I mean, Oz and I have talked about this. Something happens maybe for the boys where they become sort of slugs, right? To kind of move at this glacial piece. The German word is a Faultier. What is that creature? Is a sloth, right? A sloth. The German actually says lazy animal is what they're calling it. The slow moving, and it's also less clear for O. There may be things about peer culture norms, museums and intellectual activities are uncool. We're kind of still trying to work this out. Timing, we were expecting this has to do with puberty. And then fortunately, juvenile delinquency is not called old man's delinquency, right? So that means it's a temporary phenomenon. So that's hopefully 90%, Terry Moffat says, will grow out of this. And this is that same internet sample. And there is the Valley of Tears, as I call it, for the parents. A friend of mine said, the most selfish species is living in my house. Those are teenagers. That's low A. And then low C right there. And you can see age 13. And you think there are rays of hope on the horizon, and then it will go back up. So I thank God every day that I decided to teach college students rather than middle school and high school. And if you want to see this in perspective, right? So this reversal of the maturity principle. Look at that. That's conscious. They're the nice pink pony kids at age 10, and then it goes down bad. And then they come back up. And then, it kind of is sort of a positive development story from then on. Phil, that answers? Okay, all right. So gender differences, we know that women score higher on this broad N dimension. What we didn't know really is, like agreeableness, it could just be something that's happening since age 3, right? Turns out that girls score higher on A from very early on. But is that true for N as well? And it turns out no difference at age 10. I mean, this is a non-difference. And the sad thing, as we see, the guys are sort of clueless. They're not actually really going down. They're just kind of meandering along. Whereas the girls have increasing levels of negative emotionality and risk for affective disorders. Now, before you get depressed, there's a positive endpoint here. That goes away. That seems to be a phenomenon of early adulthood. And by the time we're 65, at least in our data, the difference goes away. So I want to show you a little bit more of this. So the other thing that personality psychologists, social psychologists are very concerned about, we learned about in 2010 that weird country data are bad. And this is like bad, not the good bad, but the bad. Because weird means white, educated, industrialized, not right wing, but what are rich, yes, and democratic, right? Supposedly democratic, holding our breath. So the idea is go south and go to school to kind of do this in better ways. And I wanted to show you more oceans. And Conrad made this lovely slide, right? All this lovely blue stuff. And there's Rio. This is where I really wanted to go. I want to write a paper, personality in Rio. Personality on the beach or something. But unfortunately, Rio is not part of the thing. Do you see that little star up there? That's a state that voted for Lula, so it's reverse, right? So the north is poor and has no industry and is kind of hard on people. There's a state called Ceará, the capital is Fortaleza. And there's a long story, but the short version of this is that they said, even the economists are saying that socio-emotional stuff is important. So will you help us? And this is a picture of Sobral, the city. And we arrived. This is a team. I'll show you a picture of the team later. I have found this at their school. So they don't have an ocean. They have a tree. Look at this. There's a tree, right? And it has, I love autogestão, that's self-management in Portuguese, and determination, persistence, organization. So the schools actually are buying in. And it's this amazing experience that after sort of being harassed about traits and personality and they can't change, etc. There's like, look, they made T-shirts with a big 5 on them. This one here says, respeto, respect, empatia, confianza, trust, amabilidade. Is that a great word for amabilidade? And says the world needs all kinds of minds. So they feel that the kids, got into this thing that those are the skills that you need to accept kids who are different and have disabilities, etc. And here you see they're learning about emotions, right? So these are tools for the teachers, different kinds of emotions. And in the back, they learn about the big 5, shockingly. I never understood the pencils. So this is something that they at the Institute are doing. So, somebody suggested is to sharpen your skills. Okay, all right, fine. So there's the pencils. And what are they doing here? They're filling out our internal surveys. And then afterwards, we get to go and hang out in these street cafes. And what's amazing, one of the reasons why Brazil is a good country to see whether these effects hold is that it's much more interdependent, affectionate. There's a concept that we have that colleagues of mine, it's called fear of happiness. Turns out the Japanese are the highest on fear of happiness. The Brazilians are the lowest. Happy, bring it on. More happy, bring more of it on, right? And it's really quite remarkable to see that the one problem that culture has is that they can't say no directly. So you have to be really careful. You're asking people, they say, sure. And then you wonder why it never happens. And you realize, that's not kind of part of the language. So that's the a problem piece with high levels of A. So do we replicate things? So this is now I have a note here that says, so this is the entire school system. The mayor said, we're going to do this. So 2,400 kids in each grade participate. So it's like a full population sample. And so they were all tested in 2018. And grade 5 is 11-year-olds, 12, 13, 14. So this was almost a little eerie. So you can see it clearly goes down, right? And then, maybe it's starting to come back up. So we'll have to do that next, but they're off to a different school. So things become complicated, right? So it's great if you can work with a school, but doesn't necessarily give you the whole thing. And this is for A. And you can see that they are higher on A in the sample. And then the final effect was for N, right? So you see again, the boys, did I skip over something? Should I go back? You're good? Okay. And it's N, so nothing happens for the boys and the girls go up. And these are pretty substantial effects for the girls. Those are about 6/10 of a standard deviation. So that's not something to sneeze at. Now, again, I can, criticize, my own stuff because it's not longitudinal and who knows what might be happening. So I happened to go north to a very northern country, and I ran into a wonderful person. We were both hired to do some work in Oslo, but she is actually in Trondheim. Did I say that right? Trondheim? Okay, great. And so now you can see how far north we're going. And I think, Celia, I got the little star wrong. I apologize, but totally wrong. Okay. Okay, it's at least in the right country, right? So we got that. And it turns out that, I apologize, another weird country, right? But it is clearly different from what we have studied before. And Celia Steinsbeck, who is here for the year on a Fulbright, and again, an intergenerational research team. Was Lars your advisor? Yeah. So he's kind of important for the study, and another collaborator looking at the data. Now, this is also sampled from a full population, all 4-year-olds born in 2007 and 8. So there's about 700 kids. Yes. Ah, that's right. So it's the 4-year-olds, yes, studied. That's right. Okay, thank you. And so 700 is not quite the same as the 1,000 per year, but it is much more controlled. And you now know the drill. Conscientiousness goes down, agreeableness goes down, and there's that horrific pattern again for the girls on end. So this is important for 2 reasons. One is that people need to know, right? Parents need to know that this is a normative pattern. Teachers need to know. When I talk about this in schools, they're saying, gosh, it's a relief. It's not us, right? It's something that happens. The other thing is interventions. And that's one of the things that we are now trying to work on. We started our own longitudinal study in Sobral. So this is started in 2018. On the left-hand side are the cross-sectional findings that I just showed you. These are the longitudinal. So this is 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. Do you see a difference between the 2 graphs? This is the girls going through the roof. Anything happened to screw up my longitudinal study? That was the pandemic. So that kind of ruined the normative study, because even though we can look at pandemic effects, right, in a really quite nice way, it does not help us with the other stuff. So let me just tell you briefly about what happened in Berkeley with the pandemic, and then I'll wrap up. So this is a project with Ryan Landell-Crea and Rosalinda Nava and Megan Barlow. We were looking at personality environment interactions. That's probably the most important thing that personality people can contribute, which is the realization that we don't all react the same way to the same objective stimulus. That's Caspian Dem's reactive and construal in personality. George Kelly said reality is always interpreted, appraisal in emotion approach, right? Meaning making, right? That we give meaning to the events that happen to us. And my wife wants to call this, my wife claims she is less extroverted than I am. She thinks the world is not quite as kind and welcoming to people that are more introverts. So she thinks this is a study that shows the comeuppance when the extroverts get their comeuppance. But the question here is, right, extroverts tend to be higher. Let me see, where is this? Extroverts tend to be higher on positive emotions. They feel confident in social functions and large events with strangers. Remember the work with Anne. They anticipate pleasure from meeting new people. They have a lot of HAP emotions. HAP stands for high activation positive, like energized, amused. Well, what happens to their approach systems when they're not getting fed, right? When you lock them up during the pandemic. My daughter was a freshman high school student. She did not make a single new friend in the entire year. I mean, that's a sobering fact. And we had already seen in some cross-sectional data that extroverts appraised the pandemic more as a loss, and specifically missing social contacts and meeting new people compared to introverts. So there's this interesting possibility. This is a situation where the extroverts are doing worse. And this is from Ryan's dissertation. So it's a prospective study because Ryan had a sample of 500 people that were supposed to participate in an in-person experiment. And guess what? That experiment never happened. So he said, look, let's do a pandemic study. I didn't want to do it because I thought we have more data than we can already use, but we did it anyway. So we studied positive emotions, negative emotions, and this is kind of a multi-level modeling that Ryan figured out. So this is their HAB scores. T0 is January 2020, so clearly before the pandemic. T1 is May. So we are still in the lockdown, right? So you're removing all these opportunities for social contact. And you can see, first of all, there's a big effect of time, right? Everybody comes down in terms of being amused. The pandemic was not funny, right? In terms of amused, interested, energized. But you can see, and it bugs me that it's not more obvious, and you can see that the extroverts came down much more than the introverts, right? And in fact, it's like the slope is twice as large for the extroverts, about 1.3 versus this about 0.7, 0.65, something like that. So is a clear and strong interaction effect, and we pre-register it. So we are very pleased with ourselves. We also thought that there would be action for negative emotions, right? So we thought the extrovert should be more frustrated, right? They should be more annoyed and sad in particular. So this is a 3-emotion composite. But if you look closely, the introversion effect, the one that's on the top, right, is actually more pronounced. So talked to my clinical psychologist wife about it. She said, duh, you have people that are uncomfortable in, going out and about. This is sanctioned avoidance, she said, sanctioned social avoidance. See that, a lot of my patients are saying they're just fine not having to go out. And so they're actually coming down. It turns out that drop is the significant drop. So the one that we didn't predict is the one that is most important in this interaction. But if you look, and then I think, Ryan, right, you looked at anxiety, which would be the thing, right, that you would be having less of an experience of if you are concerned about going out. That's actually then carries that effect. So what we're going to do next is to look how this connects up with who did they live with. So we have information about their social network. Did they live with parents? Did they live with a girlfriend, with roommates? Time spent. So we're looking for risks and buffers. And it says, are we there yet? My kids in the car say, are we there yet? Yes, yes, yes. We're going to go right to here. We're going to skip openness to others and go with conclusion when old people give advice. Okay. So let's review. So we solved some problems with Richard, right? So we now have a way to talk about these kinds of patterns in affect, cognition, and behavior. And I explained why the broad 5 doesn't quite sound as sexy as the big 5, right? The broad 5, I don't think it's going to catch on. Then we talked about personality as medium stable in terms of your marital plans, but it also develops towards greater maturity, and that's the CAN, where we see most of that. And we saw this dip in adolescence. We said that we saw that personality predicts important outcomes in people's lives: school performance, juvenile delinquency, adjustment, and well-being. I skipped composition of your social networks. That's kind of a pretty impressive set of important outcomes. And then that personality interacts with the environment. That's probably the main message, right? That there are 2 important effects. One is construal, that we perceive the world in different ways. And how we do this? Well, our personality provides sort of a lens into what's going on. It's about meaning making. What kind of meaning do we give to the events in our lives? Are they stressors or are they challenges, right? Putting this talk together, I could certainly say was a major challenge, was not always fun. And then selection effects, that's people select into certain kinds of environments. Why are you guys all here? If you just look at the number of foreigners, right? I mean, even people that have been here at Berkeley for a long time, right? There's some Canadians, right, that are here for a reason. So that's bad for clustering, right? So all the open people live at the coasts. That's really not so good for our electoral system. And then we saw that research in weird countries can sometimes be replicated in cool countries, right? Cool like Rio. And then future directions really is there is some data now out there that personality can be intentionally changed. So it turns out therapy has changing effects on your personality, which is, doesn't always happen, but can. And then I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of advice, right? So if you look at what the advice that we give our children, this is pictures from the public Berkeley schools where my children cooperate, be respectful, persevere. I have to see high quality pictures that I've taken with my old iPhone. So that's it? That's it? That's only A and C, right? Well, what's missing? So my new party trick, right now I have a model with 5. I can say, you got only 2, where are the other 3? Why don't you have them, right? So I say, where are the other 3? The schools are struggling with them. Intellectual curiosity and creativity. Those children are complicated, that ask all the questions. And, my youngest wanted to paint the little Easter chicks green. And they said, no, green is the grass and the chicks are yellow. And she said, no, my chicks are going to be green. And they had never heard of Van Gogh and blue sun. That's just kind of a problem. So it's something that we think is important. N is certainly important as well. You want to have some vigilance, but don't worry too much. And then E, what's E about? These are people in the Brazil team that worked on this. I didn't know any of these people before I went to Brazil. So meet some new people and enjoy, learning new things from them and have new experiences. And on that, I want to say giant thank you to all my wonderful collaborators. Several of them are here. And my current and former students and the Berkeley and the Berkeley Personality and EER, the ear, right? It's the ear lab. And thank you so much for bearing with me. All right, anybody who wants to ask a question can ask. I'm also happy to linger. Yes. Carolyn.
Are there studies of partners and what's happening? Because it seems to it's not often and something about the combination and what happens as people do.
I think the basic point was that we have this naive assumption that the other person's personality is the way it is, it's not going to change, right? And that's what I wanted to get across, that there is considerable change, more change than we think. So we know this now, number one. And then the other thing is that we need more of the studies where there's 2 participants, right? Now, the problem is getting even 1 participant to participate regularly. I mean, you guys have been doing families research, right? It's just super hard. Now, you expected to have 1,000 in order to publish in the better journals. So that kind of raises the bar. But I think that you are absolutely right, is that you need to kind of develop together, right? If you develop in different ways, in ways that then become incompatible, that's certainly a problem. But I think people need to sort of allow their partner to develop and change and engage with that. Yeah. So not much out there in terms of good data.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So can you talk a little bit about like between people change versus within person change? Because when you said, people assume their partners wouldn't change, I had the opposite intuition, like women always think they can change their husband, right? They can better them, make them more conscious. That's the problem.
Right.
The opposite. So how do those 2 intuitions like mesh? Are we talking about the same thing? Like what is changing?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I kind of made that joke. Guys, will you change?
Can you
right?
repeat for the people on Zoom? They can't hear the questions.
Okay,
Sorry.
so the question Oz is saying that even though many of us assume, that our partner has this wonderful personality, now that they will keep that, right? We also, there's a secondary idea that we think that they will change in the things that we like less about them. Now, John Gottman, the Gottmans, the couple basically said, you got to pick somebody whose faults you can tolerate, right? That they don't drive you so crazy that you need to kill them or divorce them. And that's probably the best advice that I've heard, is that, you know, if it's something that doesn't bug you so much, you can live with that. There are these data that say that people can change and it can be intentional, but the big question is whether your partner wants to change them, right? There is always this kind of issue that it may be really hard to change, and that, you know, it may be too painful to do that. So, you know, therapy, there's a meta-analysis that came out just a couple of years ago that says that therapy has a positive effect on personality change. But again, the data isn't great. Most of it is self-report, you know, so we want to know more before we recommend that. And then I have several colleagues. There's a team in Switzerland that is working on sort of like an intentional change program where you sign up and you have goals and so on. So it's, I'm optimistic, but the partner will have to want to change. Yeah, Rich.
It would be interesting comparison between people who stay married and people who become divorced in terms of personality change dynamics. One, you have that attraction there, talking to a new world.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you would basically have to get the two people that no longer want to talk to each other into one study. I mean, are there other?
One person, you know,
Oh, yeah.
one gender from either forced or not, and with the personality change dynamics.
So in the Mild study, there was a substantial number of women, and you saw this in the normative data as well, that decreased in N. And they talked about, and this is not, we've never done that particular analysis, but they talk about how their marriages were easier and more positive, you know. But the biggest effect for marriage we found is the teenagers leaving. When the teenagers are finally gone, your marital satisfaction goes back up. So that's a kind of a situational, not a personality effect. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I did not want to come across. So, okay, I'm supposed to report the question from Özge that are there analyses or data on structural aspects? And so I certainly did not want to come across as it's all biology. Absolutely. We think that girls have a lot of, and Steve Fincher talked about like the triple bind, right? Where you get singled out, people feel comfortable making comments on your body, your appearance, and so on. So that this is a time of much additional pressure, right? I mean, that's why I said I'm sort of apologize for the guys who are just cluelessly bumbling along, right? And so the question is, what is that interplay of environmental and personality variables, and what can we do in the schools, right, where the girls are, right, to nip some of that, about to kind of do preventative stuff so we don't see those increases that come along with the risk factors, right, that follow from that. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering if you had looked at this from an evolutionary perspective as well, because these are like such important pillars of like, you know, who we are and how we act. It seems like, you know, looking at this in non-human primates.
Yeah, so there is, so one of my students has done a whole series of studies on animals that are, I mean, on non-human animals, right? I mean, we're animals too. So, and it's this idea, right? If there really is, you know, evolutionary continuity, right? And so he had a grant from the military, to work with dogs that find bombs, explosives in the ground and so on. And so it's kind of interesting. I mean, you can make guesses beforehand if anybody wants to, but clearly you think about, right, approach. I mean, even in a study of octopi, they have found reliable individual differences, whether the octopus is going to approach or not, right? Vigilance would seem clearly, right? There's anxious mice and less anxious mice. And there's like some breeding studies where they have worked on that. Our caregiving, right? All the stuff about the moms licking their pups and so on. And exploration, all of it is like some studies of field mice, about how far they would explore and so on. So the one that in this big literature review didn't come up is C. And the idea with C is that you may need something about that prefrontal cortex, something about regulatory processes, planning ahead. I find it very hard to convince my dog to plan ahead in terms of his food intake for the next 3 days, right? So there don't seem to be reliable individual differences on that. So Sam Gosling called it the M4 for the mammalian 4. So let's see what else. Yeah, so it turns out what's super cool is there is evidence for C factor in great apes. And so I think there's now 2 or 3 studies of chimpanzees and another one of gorillas, I think, where they had the people interacting with the animals, do ratings, etc. So it's absolutely fascinating, to see that. If you think about these 5 functions, there seem to be really fundamental ways in which mammals interact with their environments, right? So it would make sense. Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Oh, Iris, were you
I
calling
cannot
on
hear.
me?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Oliver,
Hi, Keenan.
really fantastic talk. I had a bit of a theoretical question for you. So, for a long time, our field, particularly those of us who are interested in kind of physiology and neuroscience and stuff, has been looking for like reliable neural correlates of the big 5, and really haven't found, by and large, right? There's hits here and there, but by and large, we don't find all that much like you might expect to for such a dominant personality system. And, thinking about like the lexical hypothesis for how the big 5 was very creatively kind of emerged and developed that you so nicely described to us. What is it about the way that, it might be a little bit unsurprising, like what is it about the way that lexical descriptors would covary that would map onto neurobiology, how neurobiological systems function? And so it kind of leaves us with that multi-trait, multi-method stuff that, Campbell and Fisk have been talking about for 60 years now. And I'm just curious, just your high-level thoughts on where should personality neuroscience go? If you're interested in neural correlates of really these domains that are largely defined by self-report, what should we be doing to sync up with the big 5? How do we kind of make kind of physio and neuro stuff tractable in relationship to all of this wonderful work that you've been presenting?
Right. So the question is, did everybody hear this? So the question is about how do these different levels of analysis, right, these relatively aggregated personality characteristics that we're measuring with self and peer and observer reports or teacher reports and so on, how does that map on broadly neuroscience data? And so it's not my specialty, but there's sort of 2 thoughts. One is James Gross and a couple of other people published a study early on where they had responses in different brain regions connected with extroversion and neuroticism. And I teased him lovingly because he's a good friend, because they had 18 subjects. And so the correlations were like 0.65, now I know that nothing that I do correlates 0.65. It can't, right? Anything that correlates 0.65 means it's like most of the variance of the thing, right? So that's just not going to be possible. So there is the methodological issue that accumulating data sets that are large enough to detect these kinds of associations is hard to do. I think that's one piece. And then the other piece is going to be that we need to learn where to look exactly, right? There's another failure that I didn't mention at all, but there's a guy named Plomin who about 20 years ago said, look, all the stuff, Oliver, that you are doing is going to be all wiped out the window because we're going to be, we're going to have the human genome and everything is going to derive from that. Well, guess what? It turns out the human genome is a lot more complicated, and any set of genes don't really predict very much, right? So in the end, I think that we don't understand the kind of the systems and individual differences in those systems. It's the same thing like with physiology, right? So some of these physiological signals, don't map simply onto each other as well. So Oz, for example, has done some work with specific tasks, right? So there's like the go, no-go task. But then it turns out that tasks that are really good at eliciting differences across situations and different kinds of manipulation may not be really good at eliciting reliable individual differences. So I think we're just not quite there yet, is my take. And that what I'm hoping, right, is that the sort of initial taxonomy that we have now, right, in 10 years, when we talk again, I'm going to be retired and happily cheering you guys on, that you guys have something better that is more directly founded in sort of, fundamental primitives that you are getting from the other side. I mean, somewhere we have to meet in the middle, is my take. So I think that your observation is right, that there isn't, clear mappings at this point. Now, on the other hand, we're getting clear mappings with things like ADHD, right? So that sort of says we're not just running around in the dark. On that note, how about Stephen? No.
All right, I'm unmuting. So
right.
You made a reference, can you hear me?
Yes.
You made a reference to the triple bind a few minutes ago. Sorry, my voice is getting out a bit today. And the idea here is, just to elaborate, we know that in most cultures, girls take off in terms of personality traits, as Oliver has so articulately presented, and major depression and anxiety beginning at about age 11 when puberty hits. But it's not just a biological phenomenon. In fact, over the last 25 years, secular trends are that depression is emerging ever earlier in girls, rates of self-harm are emerging well before the age of 10. And I learned in grad school that a woman had her first episode of depression when she was 30, and now the average is about 17 or 18. So it can't be all biology. There's got to be environmental forces that are unleashing and unearthing. And the triple bind quickly is, girls are still socialized to be compliant and nurturing. Now with Title IX and everything else, they've got to be super competitive and are outperforming boys in college and graduate admissions and law school and med school. And they have to do it while looking sexualized and hot and being effortless, which is physiologically and psychologically impossible to do. So I think it's entirely possible to have heritable influences, pubertal influences, interacting and transacting with culture change that's producing this conflagration of personality in context with some very dire consequences.
Everybody hear that? So basically, Steve was elaborating on the triple bind and also the trend in changes in our society, like with social media, et cetera. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for hanging out and asking questions.
Thank you.